That's quite a nice way to exit, wasn't it?
Well, I would rather have not had to use a chopper, but yeah, it certainly gave us a good view of the devastation it's caused.
And what does it look like?
Oh, it looked like a bloody Great Lake. Yeah, it's pretty horrific, right?
And so what is the history to this? I mean, the Otago Regional Council, they know obviously what they're dealing with here. What have you been trying to do to get them to do something about this?
Well, we had a significant event in 2010, and we had some flooding. I didn't get flooded. This is the first time since I've lived in the house, that I've had water in the house, and it hasn't been a lot, but enough to be a pain in the bum. So the council always has an aftermatch and what have you, and talking to the people there, and like a lot of nice guys, but they sometimes talking a little bit above people, but they were saying that the flood bank, no, well, it's not actually, because we were telling them that it needed maintenance, and they said, oh, no, it's not actually our asset. So we then had to prove that it was their supposed asset. So I was lucky in the fact that I actually knew the guy that built the flood bank. I rang him and spoke to him. He's long since died. Guy Tweed, very nice guy, good contractor. And he gave me the name of the people that were in charge of the actual build at that time, so I spoke to them. Me and another guy from Henley, actually, Jay put a lot more work into it than I did, but he made a very good presentation. We took some readings off the lampposts using them as a median and using a laser level to get a rough level, by no means survey quality, and then presented that to the council, and then we'll have to look at that. Then finally, 2 years later, they accepted it into their assets, but because of their budget, they couldn't actually do much maintenance.
All right. So what is it that you want them to do?
Well, it needs, like most flood banks when they're built, they have a time period of settling, and then they're normally topped up again. So it would be nice for it to be surveyed, resurveyed, and topped up to the levels it should be. And admittedly, it may not have stopped this flood, but there are low spots in the bank that need maintenance. There's check valves and stop valves in the bank that need maintenance, and also, as we pointed out to them, we have a large catchment area behind our house, or our houses, that once the river comes up and stops the flaps, or shuts the flaps to the pipes that drain our area, we then get the runoff. It's prevented from exiting through the flood bank, so then it builds up behind the houses. So we put a bit of a proposal to them where they could build a small flood bank to point it in a certain direction, where we found with the levels where when it floods, it's a great chance to see where your levels are, and that would prevent flooding to probably most of the houses. Right. Well, mitigate it anyway.
Yeah. All right, sounds like quite a lot of work to be done there. Hey, just before you go, Alan, you left your dog there. How's your dog going?
Oh, he's fine. No, we got back in there yesterday and started cleaning up. And, he was really happy to see us.
Good to hear there was a happy ending there. Yeah. Thanks, Alan. Appreciate your time. Alan Innes, 8:15.
Well, 15 prisoners subjected to double bunking have complained of being sexually assaulted by their cellmate. And this comes between 2010 and 2016. The Ministry of Corrections gave the figures to RNZ News under the Official Information Act after the sentencing of Stephen Mark Gotti. The repeat sex offender was allowed to choose his teenage cellmate, whom he then sexually attacked, once the cell door was locked. Well, let's talk to Roger Brooking further about this. He's criminology tutor at Victoria University. He's also worked in prisons as a counsellor. Now, he also asked Corrections to explain how a 57-year-old with more than 140 convictions, including rape, was allowed to double bunk with a 19-year-old. Roger Brooking's with us now. Good morning. Are you satisfied with the explanation that you've been given?
No, I'm not, Susie. I think that Corrections has been less than forthcoming with the truth on this particular issue. As far as I can see, what they've said to me in their response to my OIA was that the young 19-year-old somehow was persuaded to move into Gotti's cell, and when the staff were supposed to do their lock-up procedures, they never bothered to move him back. So that was the first mistake. And then they claim that they carried out a sort of assessment, a cell-sharing suitability assessment, retrospectively. Well, it's too late by that stage. He'd already been, sexually assaulted.
OK, so in the information that you've been given, it says that both of the prisoners were on remand at the time. Is that your understanding? Because that seems to be the setup where both cellmates have to be on remand if they're going to be sharing a cell in this circumstance.
Exactly. Corrections has a policy that remand prisoners are not to be placed in the same unit, let alone the same cell, as sentenced prisoners. Corrections have said to me that they were both on remand, but if you look at the judge's sentencing report on Gotti, he was already in prison for a previous sentence for a sexual assault on a 17-year-old. So he was a sentenced prisoner and the young fellow was a remand prisoner.
So how is it explained then that this 19-year-old was allowed to share a cell with a 57-year-old in this circumstance?
It's absolutely beyond my comprehension. The sort of risk assessment that corrections is supposed to do is meant to take into account the age of the two prisoners. Gotti was 57, the young fellow was 19. It's meant to take in their experience in prison. Gotti had been in prison 24 times, and the young 19-year-old was on his first remand ever in prison. 19-year-olds are not supposed to be placed in shared cells with adult prisoners anyway, so there was a whole raft of considerations that corrections theoretically should have taken into account, which they completely ignored.
Is this something that was missed? Is this a case of mistakes being made and that people are fallible? Or is this something you think that was willfully overlooked?
I think it was overlooked. I think they probably saw these two guys in the same cell together and simply couldn't be bothered doing anything about it. In saying that, Susie, I think this is part of a much bigger problem, prison overcrowding. The reason these guys were in the cell together is because of prison overcrowding. And in particular, this goes back to the Bail Amendment Act, which was passed in 2013, which made it very difficult for prisoners to be bailed into the community. Now they have to prove that they're safe. And so this young fella, prior to 2013, would not have even been on remand. So
it also says in your OIA, I think the wording is that they were voluntarily in the cell together. One had voluntarily moved into the cell with the other. Is that normal practice in prisons, that people are allowed to choose which cell they are living in?
Not to my knowledge, no. I don't know the details of exactly how prisoners get assigned to particular cells, but, corrections is a place managed by very strict rules. I guess if the cells are open during daytime unlock, they can kind of move in and out. But when it comes to lock up at night, they have to be in their own cells. I mean, theoretically, if this young 19-year-old was not in his cell, corrections should have, been looking at, well, has he escaped? This should have been a major incident. Instead, it was completely swept under the carpet by the Corrections Department.
How reluctant would prisoners be to come forward to say that they had been sexually assaulted in prison?
I think they would be extremely reluctant. I mean, the figures that have been provided were, was it 15 prisoners in the last 7 or 8 years?
Between 2010 and 2016.
Right. Well, I would imagine the real number is anywhere between 5 times to 10 times that. If you get sexually assaulted in prison, if anything happens to you in prison and you make a complaint about it to the Corrections Department, well, you're asking for trouble. So this was a vulnerable 19-year-old who's, and generally speaking, I think prisoners are extremely reluctant. There's a culture in prison that you don't dob in those kinds of issues.
Is there an assumption by the public that this sort of thing just happens in prison? Is there sort of a tacit acceptance that it's just part of prison life?
I suspect there probably is. The sort of prevailing idiom is do the crime, do the time. And possibly the public don't really care too much. Perhaps they just assume that this is normal life. And in many respects, perhaps it is normal. But that doesn't mean it's acceptable. I mean, this is appalling, in my opinion. And it appears to be going on far more often than the Corrections Department statistics suggest. And it all comes back to prison overcrowding and the fact that, the government is so willing to build new prisons in order to deal with the housing problem far as I can see.
That's possibly a separate issue, but what do you think corrections should do here to break the cycle around this? If you're saying that there's a problem with people coming forward because they don't want to deal with the consequences because they're still going to be in prison afterwards, how do corrections actually grapple with that?
I don't know that you can deal with that. To me, the only way that this issue can be dealt with is if New Zealand actually thinks outside the box. And what I would like to see is that a government, a political party, actually adopts a policy to reduce the prison population. I can advise that Gareth Morgan's Top Party, when it announces its justice policy in the next couple of weeks, they are going to announce that their policy is to reduce the prison population by 50%. If we did that, there wouldn't be overcrowding and there wouldn't be cell sharing. To me, that's the only solution to this problem.
Thank you very much for your time this morning. Roger Brooking there, a criminology tutor at Victoria University. He's also worked in prisons as a counsellor. It's 22 minutes past 8.
The budgets of low-income families are getting tighter and tighter, and many are struggling to put food on the table. The number of children living in poverty is